Welcome to the Manhood Simplified podcast, where with each episode, we'll be helping you unpack some of the issues to do with masculinity in the South African context. I'm Ayanda Nyati.
And my name is Kameli Shepovana. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the Manhood Simplified podcast.
Today, we're speaking about all things to do with toxic masculinity. And for that, let's introduce our guests. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the program. Please tell our audience who you are, which organization you're part of, and the work you do.
My name is Katlego Rasibitse. I work for Sisonke National Sex Workers Movement. It's one of the biggest female black-led organizations in the whole of Africa. I do national organizing, and I'm also part of the Global Fund country coordinating. We're making sure we coordinate the HIV money in the response of the year 2030, where we're about to end HIV and STI and TB.
And I am Jabu Pereira. I am the director at Iranti. We are an LGBTI rights organization, but we specifically focus on transgender, intersex, and LBQ, lesbian, bisexual, and queer rights. We are based in Brixton, Johannesburg. We work in South Africa, but we also work in the rest of the continent to change hearts and minds on stigma and discrimination.
To both our guests, thanks so much for making time. It's lovely to have you on the program.
Chabu, Katlego, thank you so much for joining us. As a means to contextualize our conversation, when we look at toxic masculinity in South Africa, and we especially consider how recently it's become a part of the discourse in South African society, how far back into our country's history can we trace the presence of toxic masculinity, and how has it shaped where we are today?
Quite the question. Perhaps, Katlego, you can kick us off. Yes. I mean, it's a lot to take in our world, I'm sure.
Basically, when you look at things such as culture, it has kind of like impacted the way society behaves today. And not only that, the issue of religion, regardless whether I won't mention names, but the issue of religion has played a role whereby like a man felt, the ownership of being the owners of the world. Issues whereby like, I'll just quote, I'm the head of the house. That's when it started, the whole thing basically. And we are in South Africa whereby like women are literally trying to rise up in a manner like that. So you see movements like hashtag, I'm next, feminism. Also, we have seen the waves of feminism, how it also rolled out. These are some of the interventions that at some point women felt, enough is enough. That's now we also need to readdress how young boys are being raised. Like the issue of, I know lots of men out there are going to say, but the issue of us as men sending other men to literally go buy a wife for you because you got 100,000, then they will call it in a form of lobola. That on its own, it's another form of society where we literally stand there that my uncles are going to go negotiate with other men for a price of this particular female, and then she's bought in a form of lobola. That's another way we can call it a toxicity masculinity. Culture also plays that huge role.
Sure, already opening a can of worms with the first response, but that's fine. Jabu, what I find is that a lot of the time we don't even take a moment to ensure that people understand what we mean by toxic masculinity, right? To have toxic masculinity suggests to me that there are other forms of masculinity that exists. So let me throw you into the deep end. How would you define what a toxic form of being a man actually looks like?
Yeah, when you asked about how far one's memory goes to thinking about toxic masculinity, the first person that came to mind was Jan van Riebeeck, because you can't really speak about toxic masculinity without thinking about its embodiment around white supremacy. Because when we think about the origins of violence, we have to think about the way violence came to Africa was through colonialism. And so when we think about toxic masculinity, we have to think about the very first white men that came to our shores to enforce and criminalize homosexuality, for example. So when we think about the criminalization of something like homosexuality, it is not something that originated because it is un-African. It is something that originated in its criminalized form by white British people and by the Dutch. And so as much as those countries are now free of penal codes, we know that within Africa and South Africa before apartheid, we were dealing with hyper hetero toxic masculinity through the gaze of white men, through the criminalization of white men that want to determine what black bodies should do, what black male bodies should do, and what black male bodies should desire or not desire. And so it is very difficult to only frame toxic masculinity within the stereotype of perception that black men are violent, or that black men in all its form are inherently violent. And so the rootedness of trauma and aggression resonates deeply in our continent by the theft of white men about our land, the theft of resources, and the deep deprivation at which we still suffer within our respective black bodies, be they black, brown, or whatever. And so when we think about the trauma of landlessness, or the trauma of hunger or inequality, is that not the very system of toxicity? To be poor and to be homeless is toxic. And so we have to think about that in its larger context, right? And so I think about being a child born in PE and seeing all these signs about how my body can't go to the beach or go to a toilet or sit on a bench. I was born in 1971, where I had to constantly think about what is so sick about my body in the color that it is, that I cannot swim in this beach, or that I cannot play in this playground. And so that takes me further into my adult life, in my time of transition from female to male, and having to embody the very pain of what it means to be in a masculine body in South Africa in this time. Because that masculinity itself really embodies violence. It embodies privilege. It embodies patriarchy in all its sense. So I think we have to deeply think about that.
And sure, go ahead.
Sorry. The tail end of your recent contribution to this discussion, Jabu, it segues very neatly to my next question. And you touched on it briefly in your own submission, as far as the ways in which the concept and the idea of toxic masculinity has been fueled at the forefront by men, with the operating idea that only men have a say on what constitutes masculinity, what constitutes toxic masculinity. How do we go about deconstructing that idea, and this idea that only men have the authority to answer to what is and what isn't a toxic display of masculinity?
Goes as far as when you look, I like what Jabu said in terms of criminalization, certain aspects, especially the body autonomy. In 1957, it was a cabinet of full white people. They decided to make a law to say we will criminalize sex workers, but specifically black females were the target of that law. And we're sitting in 2022. We have a democracy, but still the majority of men that are in parliament cannot even make a decision to say, why should the police arrest the black female specifically, say, I'm an adult, my body, my business. So it also shows that, the culture that we inherited upon this masculinity, it still runs into 2022. And not only that, when we literally now, obviously, we need to at some point to do the law reform. Only 2002, the year, when now they decided, now we forget to criminalize all those who buy sex. Let's decriminalize men. But up to today, in 2022, you'd never see your media reporting around men that are selling sex who are being arrested by the police. And it also plays a quite very toxic in terms of how also the media, when they specifically report women that are into the adult sex work industry, they would always say, let's say she's dead for heaven's sake. a body of a dead prostitute was found next to da 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 da. That writing also, it's very toxic when it comes to that. And more, if you look at mostly, it's always men that comes with such stories. You know, they even call them mahoshas. It's always men, because for some women to even write an article based on another woman on its own, she will never do that, because of the minute you write something that is very toxic on another woman and you paint her, the trauma that comes after that, because of, remember, not all women are known that to be having sex work. You come as a journalist, you are a man, you write this article, you expose the trauma that comes, because their kids didn't know. For the first time now, I find out, oh, my mom was also a sex worker, but through the paper. So these are some of the things that we also need to educate those who are into journalism, that your writing should not be the recipients of this toxic writing that we have seen. You know, I know they said it when you use the word mahosha around, but on its own, it's very toxic to be walking around calling people that word, yeah. So this is how we need to educate. So it goes deeper beyond, like, ice.
Yeah, no, I can see you're very passionately speaking. Also, notice how Katlego is looking directly into my eyes when you criticize the media. But I get that. It's fine. Fair enough. What Katlego is alluding to, though, is socialization, right? There are things that we do inadvertently, sometimes voluntarily, that feed into the toxicity. I wonder how we begin, at the very least, to be aware of that, because, even some of the worst actions are as a result of the best intentions, dare I say. Jabu?
Yeah, it goes back to that old question about what is a man, what is a good man, or what is what is a woman, and what makes up a good woman, or or those kind of issues
in different contexts, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that because there are all these pressures on society to conform to particular roles. So when we speak about masculinity, do we include female masculinity? Do we embody the notion that masculinity does not belong to cisgender men? That cisgender meaning men who are born men and who or as boys and identify as boys, right? So are we then prescribing masculinity to a wider definition? So even cis men who are feminine are masculine, right? So I think that's really the issues about what do we embody? Do we support the notion of female masculinity? And how do we see that society doesn't? Is through the murders of many Black lesbians in this country who express through their bodies a non-binary identity, or a masculine expression, or an expression that's not stereotypically feminine presenting, and that's where we see the manifestation of toxic masculinity, where we start to see that somebody who does not agree with your expression believes that their actions of violence needs to be the method of communication, on that, sometimes to death. And I think that's the real hard conversations or changes that we're needing in South Africa. How many reports on a daily basis do we hear of murder of young women, murders of children, and the rate at which we communicate through violence, particularly by cisgender men in this country, is concerning. I mean, it's almost at a state of a national crisis in that sense.
Do you think enough has been done by our country's leadership to acknowledge the severity of the crisis that we face, as far as the policies and the laws that are being put in place to address any acts of criminality against women, members of the LGBTQI+ community? And how reflective is it of, in your opinion, how reflective is it of the level of seriousness that our country's leadership takes these issues?
Yo, I don't know. I
was part of the people who were actually doing the gender-based violence plan that is about to end in 2024, whereby we really bring women's issues. This was before the Boys in High GBV Code that was launched by the current president. And when you look into the plan, literally 2 billion rands that was supposed to actually be the intervention around these issues. I remember at some point one minister appears on TV to say they have safe houses. I challenge that minister to say, Minister, I cannot be in my own house as a woman being abused by a man. The next thing you want me to go to a safe house. Rather take the husband who's abusing this wife, keep him in the safe house until he's rehabilitated enough to be welcome into society. So these are some of the things that I raise. And up to today, we don't know what happened to the 2 billion. I'm saying out there, we don't know what happened to the 2 billion. That was supposed to be an intervention. So these are some of the things also. At some point, you find that also our political leaders, they do not, how will I put this? They do not necessarily entertain this, what today we are discussing, because they feel at some point it's useless because of, you wouldn't, I'll just mention, I'm not going to mention, one political party literally told us that, you know what, literally, if we were to decriminalize the sex work as the political party, we are going to lose voters. I'm like, but we are sitting on 888,000 identified sex workers, meaning I can take 40 sex workers, 400 sex workers, 40,000 sex workers, and qualify for a seat in parliament if I want to literally now to challenge them. At some point, we've been threatened the president. Said, you know what we will do is we will wait for you at the airport because we've got connections. We will wait and I will make sure on that day sex workers to understand their issues. We will wear panties and bras. The minute you step into the airport, we'll throw bras and panties at you. He never showed up at the airport. So see, these are some of the things that at some point you need to be aggressive about these issues. You say, I'm going to take action now. Because if you sit as an advocate, we sit at home, these issues, they keep repeating itself. It's almost like, it's a circle because of there's not enough intervention. Literally, maybe some of the viewers out there, they're not aware that there's specifically a gender-based violence plan, but nobody entertains it because of it has not been costed years because the 2 billion disappeared.
On that plan, though, if we can stay with it, did you feel heard at the time? I mean, when you're putting these things together, because, there's a lot of grandstanding that I find takes place. There's talks about talks, which don't necessarily, as you've pointed out, lead to any kind of material change. So at the very least, in the process, are you feeling tokenized or are you feeling actually heard on those tables?
It's quite sad because, for you to know that, but we have this document, which is a legal document. And then, but it's not even, it doesn't have any impact in terms of changes. I'll make just practical one example. When we were launching the National Strategic Plan for Sex Workers Treatment and HIV, STI, TB, it took us 3 years for just one minister to sign the document to be just an illegal document. That on its own, it shows that as a country, there are certain issues that we, are not going to be entertained until we don't know. I'm aware that currently now the country, they are going through what you call the consultations plans, The Justice Minister of Development, I was with him last week. Clearly, he doesn't have even idea that what is happening on the ground. People like, but we're waiting for the public to comment. We already submitted submissions to say, but we have submitted. We're speaking women that are being harassed daily by men who are police. You are white, minister. You're speaking from the white point of privilege because you don't understand Black women's issues on the ground. We're talking according to our research, one sex worker maintains up to 5 of kids. That's according to our research that we did. And when you address these issues to a privileged white minister who's a deputy, who's supposed to do all of these things, it's like, but we're still waiting for the public to comment after the public, But clearly you can see there is no change in the law reform.
They're detached. Right, sure. It's a lot to unpack. I'm not sure if there's anything else you'd like to ventilate, but I can't help but notice the space we're in the form of this beautiful library, and the message that we're hoping lands on specific people. Jabu, I find a lot of the time it is conversations like these that take place in echo chambers among people who know, among people who are activists, who are very active in specific spaces. And dare I say, they don't reach places where it feels like they are breaking barriers. Maybe I'm just being cynical and disillusioned. What's your take on how we can at least break those metaphorical barriers, so to speak?
Well, I think if anybody still believes or has trust in the state, then I think that's questionable, because I think we saw in our local elections just how little faith we have in the state by the voter turnout, and especially having to have survived a pandemic in this particular time, right? And we saw the rise in violence. We saw the rise in murders in this period as well. So I think there's several factors that we need to look at. Look, I'm 51 years old. There's a generational gap between what young men out there are speaking about, what they're listening to. But what I can see is that when I go onto Twitter and MacG or somebody else has said something highly controversial, there's a high level of black male participation in that. And when you look at the trends of what people are saying, is that we still have a long way to go in how particularly black men objectify women, how women's bodies are objectified in all manner. And I think we have a long way to go to kind of nurturing this younger generation of men to be more respectful, one, of themselves, because if you don't respect your body and if you don't respect who you are not going to respect your mother or your relative or your neighbor or somebody that's different to you. And I think those kind of factors, come into it. And I think the biggest challenge we have, and for platforms like yours that's beginning, is to ask, how do you move the hearts and minds of young black men? How do you move them to shift, to be more softer, to be gentler, to be more thoughtful? And I think that's the real issue: is will a platform like this reach the audience that is hardened by thinking that homophobia is acceptable or that transphobia is acceptable as a form of masculine expression? And I think that's where we're sitting in this difficulty, whether it's the government, whether it's the media, or whether it's an organization like mine. I think we are grappling with how do we shift young men in a country where 41% of the population is unemployed.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah.
Indeed. And I think as my final contribution to this discussion, just to latch on to my colleague's question, for the benefit of those who listen and engage with this conversation that we're having, who are interested in opening and broadening their horizon and their perspectives on these issues, who are interested in engineering the change that we want to see in our society, who might, as Ukakleho alluded to it earlier, feel a degree of hopelessness as far as their efforts not being matched with anything materialistic happening as far as a change being developed. How do we keep those individuals on side and part of the fight in the face of the difficulty that lies ahead of them?
Well, I think it starts by us men admitting we have failed women. This conversation shouldn't be now about us saying we should put ourselves in her shoe as men. To say, one day I want to put myself in her shoe. Then it begins with us. We as men, especially Black South African men, we have been in a phase where like there's a painted brush that, yeah, you're doing this because clearly you are a man, you deserve to do that. The minute we take such conversation and it starts with us, then it's like, for example, when you sit and it's like, but men don't want to vaccinate. I'm just making an example. But the minute it's about us men, we do not want to vaccinate, then the conversation starts to roll out. So it has to start with us to say, we admit we have failed women of the country. What's the next move? Then you see healing will take place eventually.
I think we have to do the work. I really think that we have to engage a lot more. Because if we believe that men emotions are different from female emotions, then we have a problem, because everybody hurts the same way. Everybody loves the same way. And I think we have a younger generation that's deeply hurt. They feel ignored, uncared for. And I remember just after apartheid, we used to talk about the lost generation. I don't know who invented that term, but literally somebody had made us all believe that there was a lost generation. In other words, a generation that can be written off. And I think we are heading there if we don't change this tide around, is that we are seeing, if you drive around Joburg, every traffic light has 4 young men begging. And we have normalized poverty. We have normalized that black men's bodies look like this and should be like this. We see trucks of black men going to do cheap labor in this country, and we have normalized it. And we have to be deeply transformative within, when we talk about economic justice, when we talk about alleviating poverty, we really have to turn the tide, because if we don't, we're going to have a bigger problem than we have right now. And the problem that we have right now is already way bigger than a pandemic, bigger than any other crisis, where if you go to an emergency room now that we no longer have this disaster management regulation, go and spend a weekend at an emergency room and see how many black male bodies enter the casualty ward, stabbed, wounded, near death. And we have to question ourselves, like, why have we become so numb to how we see black men in this country? And the fact that that level of degradation is acceptable, even to the state, is appalling. And I think that's really where we have to see the financial shifts. 350 grant is not enough. That is we have the money. How can a country boast of making a profit during a pandemic? That SARS can go and say we have several trillion rands in our coffers, but that money is being trickled down to the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable are women, young women and young men in this country. There's a young woman going to jail for the NAFSIS money, while we have a politician that can pay 250,000 rand fine and be out of jail. We live in a sick world. South Africa is a very ill society.
You know, earlier you spoke about moving hearts and minds. Hopefully, this conversation is a good start. We'll have to thank you for your time. Thank you so much for coming through and speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. Look, we're never going to ventilate everything about toxic masculinity, but the good thing is that the Manhood Simplified podcast hopefully starts the conversation for you to finally end it.